idea that the highest summit of life can be expressed as death is a well-known fact. Thus, sacrifice and death enact the true climax for the libido, aroused and transformed through romantic love, its ultimate Dionysian expression. Enkidu will lead again the way, and in facing his own death, he reaches a new level of growth that began as the wild men who ran with gazelles. After Enkidu's bewildered cry, "Why are the greatest gods in council?" end quote, the companions swiftly realize its meaning, and Enkidu curses in rage. But then Shamash points out to Enkidu what love has done and will do for him, and Enkidu realizes equanimity. He is free from the domination of his emotions and desires. He becomes resigned to death. This is something Gilgamesh refuses to accept, his own inevitable death. With the conquest of the bull of heaven, Gilgamesh had subdued his instinctual nature, and now a further development could occur, quote, symbolized by the death of a human being, end quote. And this is from Jung, quote, demanding a surrender of the whole person, not merely a taming of his animal instincts, but a total renunciation of them, and a disciplining of his specifically human spiritual functions for the sake of a spiritual goal beyond this world. End quote from Jung. This is what occurs in the journey to the spirit world. The grieving Gilgamesh enters into this, quote, act of supreme courage and supreme renunciation, end quote from Jung, which again is taking Jung and making it gay. He strips off his clothes, wears dog skins, roams in agony and wild hills like Enkidu once did, is unable to sleep and gains no rest. Libido encourages him in a regressively reverse ecstasy. A negative form. Quote, the feeling tone of the classical hieros gamos, or sacred marriage, has here changed into its opposite. Torment instead of lust, and the martyr state, what was once felt as pleasurable, is now felt as painful. And thereby Gilgamesh passes from the sun hero to the suffering initiate. This is a long quote from Joseph Henderson. Quote, there is one striking difference between a hero myth and the initiation rite. The typical hero figures exhaust their efforts in achieving the goal of their ambitions. In short, they become successful even if immediately afterward they are punished or killed for their hubris. In contrast to this, the novice for initiation is called upon to give up his willful ambition and all desire and to submit to the ordeal. He must be willing to experience this trial without hope of success. In fact, he must be prepared to die, and through the token of his ordeal, may be mild or agonizing, the purpose remains always the same, to create the symbolic mood of death, from which may spring the symbolic mood of rebirth. End quote. Gilgamesh's journey to the Apsu, which is this abyss, is such an initiatory ordeal where with every tormented step, he gives up further his will, desire, and hope. But each step on his journey is another agonizing twist in the irony of his proud boast of his apex. Who is the best formed of heroes? Driven relentlessly, his face turned dark with dread and woe, Gilgamesh regresses. He goes backward until he is retracing the sun's path through the mountain at the world's edge. There he, quote, travels through a world of darkness. Hour after hour he travels. Thick the darkness. There is no light. This is a stunning image of the agony of Gilgamesh's dismemberment, end quote from Gardner Mayer. Passing the torture of the Sun Lord's tunnel, Gilgamesh has been rendered from the sun hero into the penitent, the spiritual renunciate, quote, in search of a windpuff, end quote, that is, quote, for the sake of a spiritual goal beyond this world, end quote. He rushes by the garden of jewels. He encounters the barmaid Siduri, who represents Ishtar's joy, dance and play only for directions to the waters of death. The people he meets on his other world journey, the Scorpion Man, Siduri, and finally Pushnabi, the boatman, all help Gilgamesh after he tells of the ache in his belly, the search for his windpuff, because this ache, this windpuff, is the libido, the sun making its descent. The descent has a goal. Quote, when the libido leaves the bright upper world, it sinks back into its own depths, into the source from which it originally flowed, and returns to the point of cleavage, the navel, end quote. That's Jung. It is, quote, the source of the waters in the center of the great abyss, end quote. The descending libido, a reverse or negative sun, leads Gilgamesh to the paradise of the Absolute through his self-sacrifice. And I was reading this out loud at home, and I'm having experience right now of the dying experience of working more actively and more productively with my shadow experience that I was mentioning earlier, where sometimes I can get caught in it and get depressed and not know how to work with it. But reading this is almost like a guide, a step-by-step guide of how a gay-centered person can learn how to work with the libido after inflation and go through the experience of death to take and follow it where it takes you. Crossing the waters of death with the boatman is an archetypal motif found in other mythologies, such as the Greek, where Charon ferries the dead across the river Styx, to cross the waters of death while alive, to cross the waters of death while alive. Most aptly pictures the experience of, quote, symbolic death, and, quote, that is at the core of shamanic initiation. Gilgamesh has already died once when Enkidu died, and then a second time in his passage through Shamash's tunnel. Each time, hope was renewed, first by arriving at the gate of the sun, then by entering the jeweled garden. Each brings him further on. Each atones for, quote, a criminal usurpation of justice, end quote. First his union with Enkidu, who had been sent to fight him, then his killing of Humbaba. The horrific ride over the elixir of Thanatos then atones for his insult to Ishtar and the murder of her mighty bull of heaven. So with this heroic sacrifice, he arrives at paradise, land of immortality. He has found the center of the great abyss, source of the waters of life. Here is the goal, because it is the home of Enki, which is Lord of initiations, goatfish god of the two streams, he of the two-faced minister. Gilgamesh has been on this god's path, so it will be ultimately bring him to Enki himself. Earlier we saw the wisdom and power of the goatfish expressed in the great Antiandromeda, the reversal of the solar myth. He rises to the heights like the goat, then plunges to the depths like a fish. So likewise, when the bottom of the depths has been reached, there lies another Antiandromeda, the opposite reversal to that one in the sky. This is why after leaving the tunnel of Shamash, and even more so after crossing the waters of death, there is found the wonderful paradise, beautiful and without evil, without death, without sin, of perfect joy and happiness. At the center of death's elixir lies the fountain of life. The goatfish god is he who has mastered the two reversals, the one above and the one below, and so united life and death in the spiral of evolution. He is, quote, again from Jung, the archetype of the spirit who symbolizes the pre-existent meaning hidden in the chaos of life. He is the father of the soul, the wise magician, an immortal daimon that pierces the chaotic darkness of brute life with the light of meaning. He is the enlightener, the master and teacher, a psychopomp, the lofty spirit of enlightenment and ecstasy, the driving daimon of wisdom, the revealer and the speaking of fountain of the soul, the archetype of the old wise man or of meaning. End quote. This mystic power of the god is expressed in the person of Utnapishtim, a living man made immortal. He represents the archetypal great sage, the wise old man, made real through individual human personality. When Utnapishtim steps forward to greet Gilgamesh, the hero meets his distant forebear from before the flood. He has reached back to the tips of his own roots as a man. Here there can be our true union of conscious and the unconscious to produce the wisdom of understanding. Quote, wisdom dwells in the depths. Being one with it means being granted a vision of deeper things, of the primordial images and primitive forces which underlie all life and are its nourishing creative matrix. End quote. Utnapishtim proceeds to teach Gilgamesh. First he explains the goatfish wisdom. There is always change. Things reverse into their opposites. Death and life express a greater whole. By these words, Utnapishtim points to what Gilgamesh has not yet sacrificed, his yearning for immortality, what has driven him into and through the Apsu, the search for his missing soul. even the love for soul, then, is another attachment to libido which must be sacrificed. Then Utnapishtim, in recounting the flood story, reveals his own entry into immortality. In doing so, he discloses secret things, probes the mystery of origins. For all alive were descended from Utnapishtim, and the flood marked the beginning of, quote, recorded time, that is consciousness, when, quote, gods were replaced by mortals on the thrones of the city streets, end quote. With the passage of the flood, human consciousness begins its irrevocable emergence from the grasp of primordial unconscious, primordial instinct. So in telling his story, Utnapishtim conveys explanatory knowledge that, quote, unties, end quote, the inaccessible. How the flood came about, how its intent was thwarted, why there is evil in the world, and how justice was established. Utnapishtim reveals to Gilgamesh the great rivalry between Enlil and Enki, who are gods in the spirit world, to save life, and how he chastised the air god. Quote, how is it? How could you, without talking it through, send the flood? End quote. The two-faced power of the clever Lord of Wisdom shows throughout the story, particularly in his words for the people of Shupabuk, while one of which is true, while simultaneously concealing the truth. The last sentence, and this is parentheses, at dawn bread he will pour down on you showers of wheat, is a pun on the words for, quote, bread, cuckoo, and darkness, cuckoo, for wheat, kiptu, and misfortune, also kiptu. It's from Gardner and Mayer, quote. With these revelations, Gilgamesh gains an understanding of the spirit world and its relation to humans, and especially the role of Enki. He is now enabled to become a disciple of the goatfish Lord. But first, the understanding must sink deeply into him. There must be another sacrifice. So Utnapishtim challenges the king to another heroism, to stay awake for a week. And then he will give the long-sought treasure. The once mighty Gilgamesh agrees to try, but he immediately falls asleep. He who sleeplessly roamed the mountains and the sea, then thus a further irony, a further humiliation of the long-gone boast, which is Iron Briggs. However, the sleep is also an incubation, a week of deep rest, compensatory, curative to the never-ending agonies of before. Something has been implanted and ready in him for the moment when, upon being awakened, Gilgamesh realizes he has failed the test. Then his despair is total and consumes the last hope. He feels the triumph of an inner devastation. Quote, wherever I set my feet, there death is, end quote. Now the power of the initiatory rite raises to a peak. At the sage's command, the boatman takes Gilgamesh, cleans and redresses him, and drapes on his shoulders the robe of life, always new, a symbol and source of rebirth, a mantle of phallic libido in the service of wisdom. A similar motif occurs at the climax of the Gnostic initiatory tale, the hymn of the pearl, which again has an amazing homosexual story that has never been proclaimed before as homosexual, but that's what Mitch does. Quote, my robe of glory which I had put off, and my mantle which went over it, my parents sent to meet me. Its splendor I have forgotten, having left it as a child in my father's house. As I now beheld the robe, it seemed to me suddenly to become a mirror image of myself. Myself entire I saw in it, and in entire I saw in myself. That we were two in separateness, and yet again one in the sameness of our forms. And the image of the King of Kings was depicted all over it. I also saw quiver all over it in the movements of the gnosis. End quote. Likewise, in the robe of life for Gilgamesh, which is making a connection here between the double soul in these stories and what Gilgamesh is able to find in his descent into the underworld, which is a mirror, a spiritual mirror, a soulful mirror. Likewise, then, the robe of life for Gilgamesh can be considered a symbolic return of the soul twin, now transformed into self-knowledge, establishing a new connection to the self and the libido through a new union with the soul. Now Gilgamesh is prepared for a crowning achievement. Utnapishtim reveals the final tunnel, points down to the last heroic descent, and Gilgamesh, now transformed, dives harmlessly into the waters of death and sinks through the special channel found thereunder to the lowest part of the Apsu. There, with a symbolic offering of a drop of blood, Gilgamesh has made amends, has atoned for himself, and plucks the fruit, the treasure, that for which all was sacrificed. There is another Antiadromeda, and he rises in ecstasy. No longer the selfish, impulsive narcissist, Gilgamesh vows to save the planet. He gets a plan. For the sake of everyone, he has himself become a wise man, a seer. Now the return from the waters of death is quick and easy, the journey through the mountains uneventful, for the power of, quote, the magic herb brings him safely over the sea to his native land, end quote. That's from Jung. Again, Mitch is bringing Jung's ideas into the story, homosexual reading of Gilgamesh about the soul. A quite similar motif occurs in the Hymn of the Pearl, which I just read to you, in which a youth takes on the quest assigned by his divine Father in heaven. Quote, "And thou goest down and brings the one pearl which lies in the middle of the sea, which is encircled by the snorting serpent. Thou shalt put on again thy robe of glory and thy mantle over it, and with thy brother, our next in rank, be heir in our kingdom." End quote. In his descent, the youth, quote, allows himself to be devoured by the monster, end quote, so as to, quote, vanquish it from within, end quote. And so he retrieves the one pearl of great price, which symbolizes his own, quote, self-integration, end quote, with his, quote, soul in the supernatural sense, end quote.